In my last few videos about DLSS 4.5 upscaling, I focused on the older DLSS versus the newer DLSS to compare image quality and performance. In this video, I'm looking at DLSS 4.5 up against FSR 4. And in my previous videos on DLSS 4.5, I figured out that really what you're looking at is the performance and ultra performance mode upscaling. Everything else you'd probably still use the older DLSS versions. And so that's what we're focusing on here. DLSS 4.5 performance and ultra performance against FSR 4. Now I'm going to start with 1440p, but we're also going to look at 4K, and we're focusing on Clair, Obscur, Expedition 33 here. And I'm already noticing some pretty big differences. For example, the branches and leaves. I see a lot more detail on the left-hand side of the screen compared to the right. And also the character, I feel like a few more of the polka dots, etc., has come through a little bit sharper. Some of the distant people detail on those also come through a little bit sharper. Also, I don't need to be taking up this much of the screen, so I'm going to be tiny over here. Unless I'm needed. So I've called your attention to some of the details. I do feel like DLSS 4.5 performance mode is looking better than FSR 4 performance mode. However, I also want to look at the other side of the screen because I noticed some stuff. So before we were looking at the left-hand side of the screen, this is the same benchmark run, but now we're looking at the right. And I want you to look at some of the details that we see on this side that we didn't see on the other. Specifically, look at things like the building back here and like the railings on it, the roof tiles, etc. Because I think it looks, again, mostly better on the left-hand side of the screen. There is a bit of more of a moire pattern happening on the top of the building compared to on the right-hand side. But if I go ahead and like freeze frame this for a second once the building's available again, I think you guys would agree that we're seeing a lot more detail in the railings on the left compared to the right. On the right, it just looks a little bit softer and more smeared together. On the left, I'm seeing a lot more individual detail. Again, on the freeze frame here, you can see if you look at the leaves versus the leaves here, I feel like each individual leaf holds together a little more clearly on the left compared to the right. So again, I'll keep this playing in motion again. By the way, this is all slowed down for the sake of, for one thing, easier to spot the details, but also YouTube compression. It will unfortunately destroy and blend together some of the fine detail differences no matter what I do, but by rendering it slower, there's less blocking and stuff that happens with the YouTube compression if we were running it at full speed. Again, the distant details, if I pause it again, if we look at elements like this back here compared to this over here, I really do just think that the details in the background on the blocks and everything just look a little bit more detailed compared to what we're seeing on the right. Neither of them is completely perfect. This is performance mode upscaling for both. Both of them are working with a 720p internal image, which is then upscaling to a 1440p output image. We can see some of the magic effects here. They're not exactly matched timing-wise between the two sides of the screen. I think they both do a reasonable job with that. But overall, I do think that the DLSS performance looks better than on the right. Now, before we let this play, it's important to know what we're looking at now. Notice that the left-hand side of the screen has now switched to ultra performance mode. This is incredibly small internal rendering resolution, but the new DLSS 4.5 preset J makes this not completely unusable. And on the right, I'm leaving FSR 4 in performance mode, not ultra performance mode. So it has more internal rendering resolution to work with than DLSS does. I'm going to let this play, and I do think the image on the right is slightly better, but not even on every element. I'm seeing more ghosting on the confetti rose petals on the left, so I think that looks worse for DLSS, but has way less internal rendering resolution to work with. Whereas if we look at the leaves on the trees, I actually think those are a little more blurry on the right compared to the left. So some of the fine details I actually think are reconstructing a little bit better even with DLSS Ultra Performance Mode compared to FSR 4 Performance Mode, despite the lower internal resolution. But I think overall, again, especially because of the ghosting issues with the petals in the air on the left, I do think I slightly prefer the overall look on the right. But it's not a complete blowout win for the higher resolution image on the right, showing how far the ultra performance mode upscaling has come for NVIDIA's new DLSS model. Now, if you're wondering, like, why not do FSR 4 ultra performance mode, there isn't one. So, like, built into games, etc., FSR 4 doesn't offer a ultra performance mode upscaling. So here I'm kind of looking at, can you now get away with a more aggressive upscale compared to the internal resolution of FSR 4 when using DLSS. This is the same settings, but again, we're looking at the right-hand side of the screen now. Again, those ghosting trails on the particles on the left look a lot worse with DLSS, like significantly worse. However, if we pause it, take a look at the railings here, because there's certainly some different characteristics. If we look at these buildings back here, I actually think you can see the individual fine details better on the left compared to on the right. However, I think once I put it back into motion, it does kind of smear a bit due to the really low resolution. Whereas I think I noticed less smearing on the right, but the overall image is just a little bit more blurry. Let me play that again, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Both of them have a lot of trouble when, like, the branches pass over the fine details. Like, there's a lot of breakup on there. I think it looks maybe slightly better on the right due to the higher internal rendering resolution. Again, the individual leaves on the trees, I think, might be reconstructing a little bit better on the left, despite the lower internal rendering resolution. But overall, I think what's interesting here is that the ultra performance image on the left is not miles worse than the higher resolution image on the right due to the new upgrade to the algorithm. I also look at things like the flowers and the grass, where again, on the right, this presents a little bit softer and more blurred together. This presents a little bit sharper, which you can perceive as a bit more detail. Now, sometimes there can be a little bit more ghosting trail behind things. Again, like this, the stack of books is leaving a little bit of a ghosted image behind it here. There's a little bit of a ghosted image behind it here, but I think it looks worse on the left. So there's certainly pros and cons to both images. And I think overall, I prefer the higher resolution internally on the right with the FSR performance mode. But the fact that DLSS 4.5 is looking fairly competitive, but using the ultra performance mode, I think is fairly impressive. I do think the particle effects right here, well, they're not exactly matched between the two screens. I think it's looking a little bit worse on the ultra performance mode DLSS compared to FSR. I think probably, again, due to the low internal rendering resolution that it has to work with. Next, we're now actually going to change the right-hand side of the screen and the left. So on the left now is performance mode, not ultra performance mode. We're still at the 1440p output, but the right is FSR quality, FSR 4 quality. So why am I comparing these? I'm checking if the improvements to DLSS performance mode has it looking reasonably good compared to the quality mode of FSR 4. And again, you're seeing it in motion right now, but if I pause it, I think certain elements of the screen do look better on the left-hand side. If I look at the individual leaves in the trees, for example, I think they're actually sharper and more put together than the ones on the right, which look a little bit softer and more blurred together. And I also think the individual, like, polka dots on the shirt here are standing out in more detail and more defined compared to on the right. I think some of the textures on the cloth also end up coming through a little bit better on the left than they do on the right. So that's kind of interesting. Now, I don't think it's a complete blowout win. In fact, I think both images look fairly good. But what's so interesting to me again here is that with the improvements to the performance mode upscale with DLSS 4.5, I wouldn't say that this is a dramatic win for the much higher internal rendering resolution that we're seeing on the right with FSR 4 quality. So, yeah, like again, I'm looking at things like this line here compared to this line here. So I'm looking at the flag lines in the background. And in motion, I was noticing some wavy breakup here that I think looked a little bit more stable on the left. Let me play that again and see if we see any more of that. So again, there's flickering on both and instability on both, but I actually think it's a little bit worse on the FSR 4 side of the image. So kind of interesting how well the new DLSS performance mode is competing against the quality mode for the FSR 4. We're looking at those same settings again, but this time, again, we're looking at the right-hand side of the image instead of the left. Again, I'm noticing a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses compared to the other settings we looked at, where if I look at these back here and back here, the railings on the building, etc., I think I can see more detail on the left. However, I'm noticing a bit more of a moire pattern on the top of the building compared to on the right-hand side of the building, which isn't good. So there's a little bit more of that flickering moire effect, which I don't like, but the actual railings themselves, I think, look more detailed on the left. And again, the DLSS has way less internal rendering resolution to work with compared to FSR here. If I pause it and we pause it to smell the roses, the details on the foliage, I think, look fairly comparable. But again, I'm noticing a softer presentation with FSR, a sharper presentation with DLSS, which to my eye does actually reveal additional detail, which I like. I've heard some people describe DLSS 4.5 as over-sharpened, but to me, I'm kind of seeing actual additional detail and definition on those. And again, if I look at things like the fence line back here, by the way, if you're watching on mobile, you can pinch to zoom. Here, I don't see a lot of individual fence line detail. It's hard to even tell what this is. Whereas here, I can actually see individual railing bits. Like that I said, again, I'm having a little more trouble making those out on the right. I'm going to go ahead and let it play again in motion. But yeah, I think it's certainly interesting to look at those different characteristics. Again, I think the leaves on the trees looking a little more crisp and put together on the left compared to the right. And again, that's despite the left-hand side having less internal rendering resolution to work with. Also interesting, again, to look at the particle effects here. I'm not sure I'm seeing a clear winner on that. We can also look at the flag lines and the stonework in the background. Notice any differences, but it's honestly looking fairly comparable on most of these, in my opinion. So now what we're going to look at is we're actually going to check how ultra performance DLSS looks against FSR for quality. So we're talking worlds apart of internal rendering resolution. And here I think I can definitively say I think the right-hand side of the screen looks better. In motion, I'm noticing a lot of breakup and disocclusion smearing behind the character in motion. You get that on both, but I certainly think it's worse on the left. I also think the individual polka dots and detail on the clothing hold up together better on the right-hand side. But honestly, again, it's interesting how the ultra performance mode doesn't look like a complete disaster the way it used to, especially on a 1440p output. Again, the individual leaves on the trees are actually fairly comparable between the two, but the ghosting trails on the petals that are falling down from the trees, I'm seeing a lot more ghosting and then disocclusion issues as those go across the screen on the DLSS Ultra Performance mode. But again, if we look at the distant details, like the people in the background, etc., I'm noticing a similar level of detail to both. We can look at the flowers on the ground in the distance. I'm noticing a similar level of detail on both. We can look at the lines of the flags on both. And again, I'm not noticing a massive advantage on those on the right-hand side of the screen. Both of them have a little bit of breakup and a little bit of flicker. So overall, I think the player character in motion and the particles drifting with a lot of ghosting on the left make me definitely prefer the image on the right, but not necessarily dramatically so. It's certainly better on the right. So I'm saying FSR 4 quality is better than DLSS 4.5 Ultra Performance, but it's just interesting to see how far the Ultra Performance mode has come in closing that gap. Here we're looking at the same thing, ultra performance on the left. And again, we can see a lot of ghosting trails on the particles here, whereas the particles are a lot more defined and fewer ghosting trails on the right. Although again, interestingly, I think if you look at the details in the fencing here and the fence railing here, I can make out the individual patterns more clearly on the left than I can on the right, which is certainly interesting considering the ultra performance mode upscale on the left, which is an incredibly low internal resolution. However, in motion, if we look at this railing here, I'm noticing right now, when it's paused, you don't see it. But in motion, I was noticing a lot of weird breakup and flicker here that looked a lot more stable on the right here. I'm going to let that play and see if we see any more of that. yeah, again, where I'm noticing some breakup on these that looks a little more put together on the right. Not perfect on the right, though, either. When the leaves pass over the building in the background, though, that's pretty rough. It's difficult for both to deal with, though. It's not perfect for either, although I think it looks a bit worse on the left. Overall, again, I think my biggest differences I notice is in the ghosting trails on the flower petals, which look pretty bad on the left and look significantly better on the right. So that's probably the biggest differences that I'm noticing. And just in general, a little bit more ghosting trails behind objects in motion on the left compared to on the right. So I definitely prefer the FSR 4 quality image over the DLSS 4.5 ultra performance image, although certain specific elements can look as good or better on the left. I think the overall presentation I prefer on the right. And again, I do just think it's interesting how much the ultra performance mode has improved. I still wouldn't really use it unless I absolutely had to, given its shortcomings. But again, if you pause the image here, like I would say they're more similar than they are different, which is kind of interesting. Ultra performance mode upscaling in the past has just been truly terrible. But yeah, the ghosting on the particle trails and when we had the player character in motion, the kind of disocclusion issues was kind of annoying. So what are we switching to now? I've now switched to 4K resolution. On the left, we're looking at DLSS 4.5 performance mode. On the right, we're looking at FSR 4 performance mode. So like for like internal rendering resolution. But notice that I've zoomed in now. The reason I've zoomed in is not all of you are going to be on a 4K display. So by doing a 2x zoom per axis, this is now displaying the proper number of pixels in the image to display properly on somebody watching this from a 1080p display. So that's why I'm doing the zoom. So for example, if we pause it here, we can see that again, I feel like we're seeing a lot more individual tree leaf detail on the left than we are on the right. Now again, I hear some people say that it kind of looks over sharpened. And so, I mean, you could take that into account, but to me, I think it's actually just more detail is being reconstructed here. And I prefer this to my eye than the softer, blurrier image on the right. Again, I think it's pretty clear that individual, polka dots on the player character are popping more clearly, the contrast between the black and white. It's less blended here. That's probably due to the difference in the tone mapping step, I think with the DLSS 4.5 update, where they now do the tone mapping after the upscale as opposed to before. So I think contrasty bits kind of pop a little bit better now. And I think I can make out the texture of the shirt a little bit better in these shadows compared to it being just a little bit more blurred together on the right-hand side of the screen. So those are some of the differences that I'm noticing when we pause it. Let's go ahead and play it in motion and see how all of that holds up. Again, both of these upscalers are now so good that I think both of them are very usable. So we're really nitpicking the details, but I do think the improvements to DLSS 4.5 are showing through when you look at some of those fine differences. Again, really look at the distant details. Look for, how much clarity you're able to get out of that. Again, if I pause it again, if you look at things like this, these branches look kind of smeared and blurry and kind of blended into the sky. These also have a bit of a smear to them, but I think I can make them out as more of a distinct contrast with the sky and more detail on individual leaves compared to what I'm seeing here, which again, I'm preferring that to my eye over what I'm seeing on the right. So I do think I am preferring the DLSS 4.5 image here on the left compared to the right. I know some people prefer a softer image with a little more blur to it. So obviously there could be some personal preference there, but I do like the increased sharpness that I'm seeing on the left. We're seeing, again, if I pause it here, if I look at the sculpture in the background, the specular highlights and detail, I think, are popping a little bit more here than what I'm seeing on the right. Things like that. We can also keep our eye on the flags in the background and kind of see if we notice any differences there. I think both are doing a pretty good job of reconstructing that. I think I see a little bit more flicker and breakup right here on this flag compared to on the left. Overall, I think both images are doing a very impressive job of taking a 1080p input resolution and upscaling it to a 4K output. Remember, this is 2x zoom and slowed down to notice these differences, but I do notice the differences. Also, if I look at the hair, I think you can see individual strands of hair a little more clearly here, and they're a little bit more blended together on the right. So again, I think if I look at the specular highlights and detail on the stonework compared to here, again, I just think it looks a little sharper and more detailed on the left, and I'm preferring that image. Let's go ahead and switch over to looking at the right-hand side of the screen. So this is the same test pass, but looking at the right-hand side of the screen. Again, keep your eye out for the details on the railings of the buildings, things like that. Look for flicker as well as detail. And kind of see how that reconstructs in motion. That's going to be a very different thing. Remember, this is 2x zoom, so this is extreme fine detail in the distant background. But again, if I look at like the individual leaves here on this, compared to the individual leaves here on this, I think this is all way more just kind of blurred together. Whereas this, I feel like I'm perceiving a little more of the individual detail. I think same thing with the fine detail and highlights on the lamppost here, left versus right. So I do think we're just getting a little bit more detail reconstructed on the left. And those fine details that should be distinct from their background, I think is more distinct and clear on the background left versus right. Again, we could pause it here and look at the railing here versus the railing here. Again, both of them, these are difficult things to reconstruct, and both of them are doing a really admirable job of doing it. But I do think that's just much more clear what's the shadowed window in the background and what's the railing versus here. It blurs together a bit more. It's harder to pick out the fine detail. If we look at this railing, again, there's kind of, you can tell that there's vertical stuff here, but it's kind of blurred together a bit. Here you can make out the individual distinct patterns a lot more. Let's go ahead and watch it in motion. And again, I think it holds up better in motion on the left than the right as well. So certainly preferring the image on the left to the image on the right. And again, these are working with the same internal rendering resolution. This is a 1080p internal rendering resolution, upscaling to a 4K output. Performance mode upscaling is 50% resolution per axis. So it's actually 25% of the pixels of native, because the area would be 25%, 50% per axis. Again, we can pause at any point, kind of look at the individual details. Again, I think you're getting more of the individual leaves showing through, and with a starker contrast compared to the light background, whereas here I think it's all a little bit more blended together, a little less distinct, which to me I think looks less accurate and less detailed. We can see a little bit of the particle effects going on with the magic. I think both are doing a reasonable job of reconstructing that, and it's not a like-for-like image just because the timing of those magic effects isn't perfectly matched between the two. If we pause here and kind of look at the details on the stone, it's kind of the same story. I just think there's a little bit more fine detail on the left compared to the right. The right is just a little bit more blurred together. So what we're looking at now is not zooming in. So if you're on an actual 4K display, this is going to be the same two tests that we just ran. But if you're not on a 4K display, it might be much harder to pick up the individual details. But I did want to zoom out and just notice how much we were nitpicking the fine zoomed in detail. The real answer is both of these images are very good. Again, some YouTube compression is probably going to add to the overall blurring and smearing compared to what you see in person. But I do think even zoomed out, I'm on a 4K display and I'm not seeing the YouTube compression, although there's some compression on the initial capture. I do definitely notice that the polka dots on the back of the player character are much more distinct and contrasting with the white background on the left compared to the right. The individual leaves in the background are certainly more detailed on the left compared to the right. And again, if I look at the stonework detail in the background right now, I do notice it more clearly and distinctly detailed on the left compared to the right. That being said, I'm nitpicking fine details. These look extremely similar, and they're both doing a really good job at pulling out 4K detail from a 1080p internal rendering resolution. So really, we're getting to a point where these upscalers have gotten very good. But there are still differences between them. This is the right-hand side of the screen again, this time done without the zoom. So we're looking at the 4K image with no zoom. So again, if you're not on a 4K display right now, it might be hard to tell. But again, even here, I am on a 4K display. Again, if you're on mobile, you can pinch to zoom. There is definitely more detail in this fencing here on the building compared to here. The railing is a lot more blurred. This is more distinct. Again, more blurred, more distinct. The leaves, more distinct, more blurred. So there's just a noticeable increase to clarity of those fine details, the fine textures, the individual elements that overall I definitely prefer on the left compared to the right. And remember, DLSS 4.0 already had some of those advantages over FSR 4. But I do think that the newer model has just accentuated those things and made them a little bit more noticeable than they already were. So again, I'm going to let it play. This isn't zoomed out. So like I said, if you're not on the 4K display, might be hard to make out some of those extremely fine details. But it's pretty much the same thing that we've been seeing. But I'm trying to give you guys a whole bunch of footage, so I know I probably could have made a shorter video with less footage, but I think I'd rather err on the side of giving you guys lots of comparison footage slowed down side by side, which is hard to do on your own when you're making these decisions. And most of you probably don't own both an FSR 4 capable graphics card and a DLSS 4.5 capable graphics card to gather this footage. So it's hard to do this stuff at home, so I'm trying to give you guys a lot to work with here. So what are we looking at now? Now, I'm back to doing the 2x zoom, because I know most of you aren't on a 4K display, but also notice that the left is still DLSS 4.5 performance. On the right, I've increased the resolution for the FSR 4 image. So this is FSR 4 quality up against DLSS 4.5 performance mode. So we're giving FSR 4 more internal rendering resolution, which also means it's going to be slower. You'll be getting less of a performance boost by enabling it compared to using performance mode with the DLSS. But the idea is to see if we can now balance out the image quality. Now, interesting to me right now, I actually still see some advantages on the left-hand side of the screen. For example, look at this, the flags hanging off of this rope right here. Look at the rope right here. It's definitely has more breakup and stair-stepping and aliasing on that rope compared to the one on the left. Also, I still think that the leaves are a little bit more put together and detailed than the right, although I think increasing the rendering resolution for the quality mode upscale on the right has helped to close the gap on the leaves. But I still see more shimmer and breakup here on the right compared to what I'm seeing on the left, which is certainly interesting to me. The fact that the quality mode is not just blowing out the performance mode for DLSS. So there certainly have been a lot of improvements to DLSS 4.5's performance mode, and I would say it's fairly competitive with FSR 4's quality mode. Again, this entire video is just in one particular game. So obviously a full review of DLSS 4.5 versus FSR 4 is certainly going to require testing more games. But again, I'm seeing more breakup on the ropes up here compared to the ropes over here when we're comparing those. So again, watch it in motion. There's some breakup on both, but I think it's definitely worse on the right-hand side despite having the increased internal rendering resolution. Whereas, some elements I think are now less of an advantage than they were when we matched the internal rendering resolution. Like I'd say I'm getting a similar amount of detail here compared to here, whereas when both were on performance mode, I think it was a noticeable advantage on the left. Here, I think it's similar levels of detail between the two, although still maybe a little bit sharper on the specular highlights on the right. So this is once again performance mode on the left versus quality mode on the right, and it's zoomed in. But we're looking at the right-hand side of the screen now. Once again, you want to focus on the fine details. You want to look at the individual leaves. You want to look at the railings on the buildings in the distance. All these types of little details. So let's actually look at things like the railings on the buildings right now. I still think the DLSS image is putting together the individual railing details slightly better than the FSR image. Again, this looks a little bit smeared and blurry, whereas this looks a little more distinct and detailed, even though it's performance mode DLSS versus quality mode FSR 4. In motion, I still think that kind of holds up. So it's not just in the still images when I pause it. So yeah, I think it's DLSS 4.5 performance mode is very competitive in this game with FSR 4 quality. I am, just for your information, planning on doing additional videos like this, testing out other games. So this isn't the only game I've tested. I was originally going to do like 4 different games in this video, but by the time I finished the Clair Obscur side-by-side footage, I realized we were already over 20 minutes of footage, and that's without me doing any pausing. So I realized, okay, I should probably have this video just focus on Clair Obscur, and then we'll look at some other video, other games in other videos. Otherwise, we'd be talking about like a multiple hours long feature film. Again, it's interesting to pause and see if we notice differences in like the stonework textures right here versus here, where once again, I feel like a little bit more detail in the textures is coming through with DLSS compared to FSR 4, despite the lower internal rendering resolution. So what are we looking at now? So now I'm looking at ultra performance mode on the left with DLSS, whereas FSR 4 is still in performance mode. So FSR 4 has more internal rendering resolution to work with than DLSS does, and FSR 4 doesn't offer an ultra performance mode, where DLSS does. Now, we looked at this for 1440p, where ultra performance mode wasn't particularly great, although it was surprisingly improved compared to its old version, whereas on 4K, it's going to be interesting. Notice we are also 2x zoomed here to accentuate the details, especially for people who don't have a 4K display. So ultra performance mode is coming from 720p to try to output a 4K image on the left, whereas the right, FSR 4 performance mode, is internally 1080p trying to output a 4K image. So that's kind of the internal resolutions that we're working with here, is 720p versus 1080p. I'm noticing more of the ghosting on the particles, the little petals as they fly around with the ultra performance upscale. Also, I think when there's disocclusion behind the player character, so when stuff gets revealed behind the player character, I think it becomes more apparent that we're working with a lower internal rendering resolution here. Like, and sometimes when I freeze it in motion, you'll see a lot of kind of breakup on the character. There's some breakup on both, and remember, we're 2x zoomed here, so this stuff would be a lot harder to make up if we weren't zoomed in and running in slow motion. But when you are zoomed in and in slow motion, I think there's more garbling behind what's revealed from the character on the left compared to the right. So you can tell that the right-hand side does have more internal rendering resolution to work with. And again, as those rose petals fall across the screen, there's some ghosting on both, but I do think it's worse on the left. That being said, the overall big picture image doesn't look dramatically worse. So I'm not going to say that ultra performance looks as good as FSR 4 performance, but I think it's, somewhat competitive. Again, I'm noticing a lot of ghosting trails on these particles for the DLSS versus what we're seeing on FSR 4. So I would say that's a place where FSR 4 performance is looking better than DLSS 4.5 ultra performance. There are some ghosting trails on the FSR 4 image, but they're a lot fewer and farther between. The vast majority of the petals don't have the ghosting trails, whereas a lot of them have the ghosting trails on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm interested to see how the buildings hold up as we get into the fine details. Okay. So by pushing the resolution so low, I'm starting to see a moire pattern. Notice that you can see these diagonal lines across the top of this building. That shouldn't be there. The actual building top is horizontal lines. So this is an advantage of FSR 4 because it has more internal resolution compared to the lower internal resolution. We finally pushed DLSS too far, and it's having some of these moire patterns happen on this. That being said, though, I think the individual railing detail here in these vertical rails does to me still look slightly better than what we're getting that looks a little more blurry in the FSR image. So I'm seeing some pattern of pros and cons between the two, although I would certainly find that moire pattern on the DLSS image to be pretty distracting when actually playing the game. So I think overall, given the increased ghosting and the increased moire patterns, I do prefer the FSR 4 image, but certain elements are pretty competitive, and like some of those fine details are actually still better on the left. So it's certainly a pattern of pros and cons between the two. It's not a clear win for either one, but my preference is certainly for the image on the right. Once again, I think because of the extremely low internal resolution, in motion, I'm seeing a little bit more breakup and smearing on some of these really fine leaves that I think are holding together a little bit more on the right. They're not perfect on the right, but I do think they're a little bit better on the right. So again, patterns of pros and cons here, pluses and minuses. I think in the end, though, to my eye and my preferences, the FSR 4 performance mode does still look better than the DLSS 4.5 Ultra performance mode. This is the same thing again, but now we're zoomed out. So we're not, well, at least we're not zoomed in. So this is not zooming in. So if you're on a 4K display, you can actually see that. Again, YouTube compression is going to be battling us here a little bit. The slow motion does at least help. But again, once I'm zoomed to normal like this, I am on the 4K display and I don't have the YouTube compression. And I can say that they're fairly competitive. Honestly, this looks fairly competitive. I do still notice the ghosting trails popping up on the left-hand side of the screen a bit more. I do notice a little bit more of the disocclusion, blurriness behind the player character on the left-hand side of the screen. So overall, I do slightly prefer the image on the right, but it's not a blowout win. So the Ultra Performance mode has become a lot more usable than it used to be, and it's fairly competitive, although again, I'm going to give the win to the FSR 4 Performance mode. And that's certainly interesting, because previously, I just didn't find Ultra Performance mode usable unless you were just absolutely like trying to use a GPU that had no business running 4K in these games. Like then you might just suffer through it if you were on a 4K display. This is the image on the right-hand side of the screen again, but it's once again not zoomed out. I'm noticing the moire pattern instantly here. My eye is very drawn to that. Whereas this one looks a lot more stable. So again, it's those little details like that that I'm preferring on the right compared to the left. Although, like I said, some of the fine detail is sometimes reconstructed better on the left, but the ghosting trails on the pedals and the moire pattern on the building, I'm just finding that to be distracting. Those are the kinds of things that catch my eye when I'm playing the game, and they break my immersion. Having a little bit of a softer image doesn't break my immersion the way noticing, flickering moire patterns, ghosting trails, those things actually just take me out of the game. And I notice that, oh, those are upscaling algorithm artifacts. That looks weird and bad. Whereas a little bit more of just a softer image doesn't have that same effect, especially when you're not looking at side-by-side footage. So I definitely prefer the image on the right, but again, I am nitpicking details. Both of these are doing a pretty respectable job of upscaling a pretty low internal rendering resolution to a pretty high output. Again, Ultra Performance mode is doing 720p input to a 4K output. Performance mode is doing 1080p input to a 4K output. Now, that is all of the side-by-side footage that I ran for you today. So my final thoughts are that the new updates to DLSS has made both the performance mode and the ultra performance mode significantly more usable than they used to be. Ultra performance mode, I didn't ever really use. Now, I would say if you're on a GPU that's struggling, it might be worth considering. Whereas before, I'd be like, turn down all the other settings before you even consider that. Now, it's not necessarily a complete last resort. Now, the performance mode upscaling, I think for DLSS 4.5 is now clearly better than the performance upscaling for FSR 4, although the FSR 4 upscaling is usable. And performance mode upscaling from DLSS 4.5 seems to be similar quality to FSR 4's quality upscale, although there's pros and cons to that. It's not a clear win one way or the other, and you might prefer one over the other. The other important takeaway from this video is that this was one game. So sometimes one upscaling algorithm will have, problems in one game compared to others. So I have done testing in additional games, but guys, this is already a 40-minute video. I didn't have time to get it all into one video. So stay tuned for additional videos comparing DLSS 4.5 versus FSR 4. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Have an excellent day.